feel like it's fair to say that the human race is kind of a whiny bunch of people. Now, I'm not talking about anything serious when I say that. I just mean that we as a people are very dissatisfied with what has happened in our personal lives and are often asking ourselves the question, what if? What if I had taken that job, gone to that school, talked to that girl, not spent the majority of my teen years memorizing Eminem lyrics so that people would think I'm cool? Damn! That was a bad call on my part. However, I think this questioning of what could have been is often wasted on ourselves, and I personally like to externalize my problems and make them somebody else's fault, and that's when I turn to music. Like, really think about it for a second. Music plays a giant role in your life. It affects your mood, it informs your opinions, it really helps define your personality, and yet it takes such a perfect set of circumstances for that music to exist in the first place. Think about your favorite album, or song if you don't have time to listen to full albums, but think about your favorite piece of music, and how that music affects you. Maybe it helped you through a rough patch, or maybe it helped you open your mind a little bit, but just think about how music affects you in your day-to-day life. For that music to exist and affect you the way it does, the artist had to get discovered, they had to write the song, they had to produce the song, make it sound good, make it sound correct to them, and then it had to go through a series of different labels or producers or whatever. I don't know how music works, but you know what I mean. Like, that music had to pass through so many people just to hit the airwaves, and then it had to get popular enough for you to be able to hear it. That's what it takes for you to listen to something that affects your life like that. Like, it's crazy to me. Because what if the artist had never released that thing? How does that affect you? How does that affect the artist? How does that affect the music industry as a whole if you're into mainstream enough music? Like, what changes if this perfect set of circumstances doesn't exist to let your favorite thing come out? That's sort of what I want to talk about today, because there is tons of music out there that never got released. It got lost to the world and never came out to affect people the way it might have. And I think that's a really interesting concept. So today I kind of want to take a deep dive into lost albums or music releases and just figure out what might have been. And yeah, I know, sometimes unreleased albums are unreleased because they are bad or even just mediocre, but we're gonna ignore that possibility for now and talk about some of the most famous lost albums and what it might have been like if they had been released. So, go ahead and grab your headphones and some scuba gear. Bare essential scuba gear. Because we're taking a deep...
Would you mind shake it off?
Shake it off. You gotta shake it off. Shake it off.
Unreleased albums are a fairly popular topic in the music industry because artists change and fluctuate over the years, and for better or for worse, they get to pick when they show that change to the public. And since artists sometimes are able to release bad albums to the public, it follows logically that sometimes they're able to keep the good albums to themselves. And since us fans hate nothing more than when artists pick and choose things for themselves, we fantasize about what we're missing out on and imagine thousands of perfect albums that we'll never get to hear. So we're gonna explore some of the albums that fans have dug around and found out about through the years and discuss what they might have been like through different research that I've done or fan speculation that I've seen. We're gonna start with albums that were mostly just rumored and had very little to no evidence that they ever actually existed. Albums such as the ever-famous and strangely frequent dual album rumors. These are albums that are rumored to release with certain projects that artists drop. It's when an artist drops a CD and fans start speculating that they have another one that's gonna come right on its tail. I think one of my favorite examples of this kind of rumor happened a couple of years ago. It was the rumored sister album to Kendrick Lamar's Damn, called Nation. Eh?
I don't think I can find a way to make it on this earth.
I remember rumors of Nation being crazy for at least a couple of weeks after Damn came out. I mean, people were putting all kinds of research into it, reading into things that Kendrick said, reading into things on the album cover. There were articles devoted to it, whole pages devoted to it, and it turned out to be half true. Kendrick Lamar technically did drop 2 albums, it's just they both were Damn. See, a little while after Damn was released, he released the Collector's Edition, which was just the same album, but with the tracklist reversed. But when you reverse the tracklist, it has a completely different tone, but is still a cohesive album. So it's sort of like getting 2 albums in one. I ended up eventually coming to enjoy that concept a lot, the idea of reversing the tracklist of an album and it still being a cohesive album with a completely different tone. I mean, that is kind of super creative and artistic and brilliant, but I will say, since it's been about 4 years since a new release from Kendrick, if you don't count the Black Panther soundtrack, it would have been nice to get a separate album with different songs. Alright, let's move on. Taylor Swift, or Swizzy by the Drop as I know her, also had a rumored album that was going to be a sister to Folklore and Evermore, because in that case, not even 2 albums was enough. The rumored album was called Woodvale. It was found in a bunch of the promotional material for the album, but it turned out to just be the working title for Folklore, and Taylor Swift had to come out and explain this whole thing to all of her fans who were pretty disappointed that they weren't going to get a 3rd helping of her indie goodness.
And so I came up with a fake code name that had the same amount of letters as Folklore, chose a random name, chose Woodvale, wanted to see how it would look on the album covers, mocked them up, and then decided I don't actually want to have a title on the album covers. And we forgot to take the fake code name off of one of them.
Is that true?
And Olivia Rodrigo is probably the most famous recent example for one of these types of rumored sister albums, as people thought her album Sour was going to have a sister called Sweet, in which she covers the more bittersweet side of a breakup and the kinder things she has to say about her ex. But I gotta say, have you seen her ex? I mean, look at this guy.
You can't seem to get me off your mind.
I think he might just be a douchebag. That one hasn't technically been disproven yet, though, so if it turns out that a Sweet does get released, we all need to pretend like it doesn't for the sake of this video, which is really sensitive, so don't say anything to it. I find this little subsect of music rumors most interesting because the dual album is a concept that actually works well in real life. Take Mac Miller's Swimming in Circles, for example. In Swimming and in Circles, Mac talks about the same themes but in completely different ways, with Swimming being more fast-paced but somber, whereas Circles is more slow-paced but optimistic, and it's really cool and fun to listen to. Or, for a more straightforward take on the concept, the Shins have a dual album called Heartworms and The Worm's Heart, which are literally the same songs played in different ways, and it provides this really cool dichotomy for every single song on the album as you can hear it played differently.
My girl, if you're lucky one day, rolling down the ancient high street, you find.
Having that kind of take on albums like Damn or Sour would be wild. These songs that resonate so widely with people having another side to them. Imagine Olivia Rodrigo exploring the sweeter sides of a breakup. After all, that's a take we don't normally get in music, but breakups do have this kind of weird sense of closure to them, and sometimes people break up for good reasons and end up happier with each other because of a breakup. I mean, that is a crazy thing to have on an album, especially from an artist who just became so famous for how well she's articulating her emotions during this emotional time for her. That would be insane from her, to have her be able to take a step back and be like, okay, this might have been a good thing too, and here's why. Or Kendrick talking about the brighter sides of life on an album like Nation, which is what the project was rumored to be when it was still rumored. That would be cool to hear from him, especially right after Damn, when we got this really, really hard take on a bunch of topics. We could get this really, really cool take on a bunch of other topics, like his spirituality, which he usually covers but didn't really get into on Damn. Of course, I'm not saying that these albums are one-sided as they stand. You could really create a dual album to any album because most topics are nuanced like that. So it's just an interesting what-if to explore because it's cool to think of an artist taking these different approaches to the same thing in a complete release like that. Speaking of Kendrick, today he's probably one of the most prominent voices in hip-hop, and it's been that way since around 2015 with the release of his album To Pimp a Butterfly. I mean, he was launching conscious rap to the forefront of the music industry at the time, and he was talking about things that normally didn't get such a mainstream audience. Arguably the only guy who was talking about things and rapping like Kendrick was at the time was J. Cole, who had just released 2014 Forest Hill Drive a year prior. If you haven't heard of either of those two albums, you really are missing out on just a giant piece of hip-hop history, but to put it simply, everybody at that time wanted to hear more from those two artists, and rumors were circling like crazy at the time that we were about to get something huge from both of them, and those rumors got even worse with the release of Black Friday.
The whole industry been in shambles. Everybody fugazi, I'm just changing the channel. Kendrick Lamar, the people's champion, I'm animal for analysts. Career damaging versus meditating when candles lit.
A remix of singles from each other's albums, Black Friday re-sparked a long-held rumor that Kendrick Lamar and J. Cole were about to release a project together, a collaborative album that, quite frankly, was going to fuck up the world. This collaboration album actually holds a little bit more weight than a lot of the stuff we've been talking about here, because it was a thing at one point that the artists both openly discussed. Rumors started around 2010 when both artists were talking about doing something like that, but they were a little bit smaller at the time and probably had a little bit more time to work on something like that.
I just started working with Kendrick the other day. We got in finally again.
That mixtape that y'all,
Oh man,
it's like folklore, it's hip-hop folklore.
Album, man.
The Kendrick J. Cole mixtape album.
What's the latest with you and J. Cole?
Shit, we just got up and locked in the studio for a day and came out with a few bangers, and it was so motherfucking crazy. We felt like we should continue making these motherfucking records and see what it turn into at the end of the day. You know what I mean? Who knows? You know what I mean? It might be a full project. It might be just some good-ass songs thrown out, but nevertheless, it's good music.
As the artist grew in popularity, the album became somewhat of an unheard legend, as people were thinking, if this is what they can do while they're alone, imagine what they can do together. And the rumors might have faded out of existence around the time 2014 and To Pimp a Butterfly came out, but the release of Black Friday and a promise from Cole that something huge was dropping February re-sparked all the rumors, set the fan base ablaze, and basically made everybody think we were about to get something huge.
But this February, bet shit gets scary when I fuck around and drop.
So, rampant speculation started, and we all started wondering what the album was going to sound like, discussing whether or not it actually existed or should exist, and it was just this crazy thing for a long time that I remember waiting for at least until 2 years after Damn came out. But it's been 6 years since the release of Black Friday, and we've gotten confirmation from several sources that no album was ever actually put together. They're not sitting on anything, it just doesn't exist, and so it just leaves us fans wondering what could have been.
So does this mean there'll never be a Kendrick and Cole album that everybody seems to think is happening?
Not for that reason. It's not that I wouldn't want to work with him. That's not the case. It's just
Okay.
that when I'm working on my album, it's just like, yo,
Yeah.
that's just how I operate. Like, you didn't ask Prince why he don't have no, and not comparing myself to Prince, but I'm saying,
Why him and Michael Jackson never did an
exactly.
album?
Why you ain't have Mike on the album, bro? I really think your album would be a little better if you had Mike.
Yeah, but so why does everybody think that this is, and why are people confirming, some people are saying, confirming that there is an album that was, even like there was Absol, somebody said, yes, they're absolutely working on an album.
Nah, he might be talking about like when we originally got up to work.
Yeah.
Like this was years ago. Like when we originally got up to work, we had we just did a few songs. Like we did a bunch of ideas, put it like that.
Right.
It was nothing like, you wouldn't call it an album, you wouldn't call it nothing like that.
This leads us into a whole other category of albums that are confirmed to be real, but that we have not heard a lot about.
I asked you to go to the Green Day concert. You said you never heard of them.
Let's start off light with something that I really only included in this list because I thought it was kind of funny, and that is an album by the Beatles. There's a ton of people who talk about a ton of different music that's either rumored or unreleased from the Beatles. They are the Beatles after all. They probably have a really large library of music lying in their vault. But the one I wanted to talk about today actually technically made it to the public, just not in the way it was intended. The album went under the working title Get Back, and it was supposed to be the Beatles trying to recapture the spirit they had for music in their early days, so they recorded the whole thing live to kind of get this raw sound, which is what they did for their first album, and the whole thing was basically supposed to be a return to form for them after a couple of outings they had and their return from a trip to India. However, the project was abandoned when the Beatles couldn't really get along about what it was supposed to sound like. George didn't like Paul's songs, Paul didn't like George's songs, and John didn't like the whole thing, so they eventually decided to leave the project to work on Abbey Road instead. But somewhere down the line, and this is where my idea of it gets a little hazy, Phil Spector gets his hands on the album. I think a couple of different versions of it were recorded and put together, but Phil Spector was the final straw, and he put it together in what a lot of the Beatles agreed was the worst possible way, adding orchestral sounds to all the live music, kind of defeating the purpose, and overall making the album worse in the Beatles' minds, and that was the version of the album that made it to the people, as Let It Be. And I just think that's so funny because it's like the studio's response to the Beatles' attempt to return to their rock roots. Like, get back, now you're gonna let it be! That was the perfect impression of a studio executive. But yeah, so the album basically became something completely different, and Get Back was lost to time. Although, we do have some idea what the album might have sounded like. Paul McCartney released Let It Be Naked, which is his idea of what the album should have sounded like based on different things that he's put together. But again, Paul had a different idea than George or John, so it might not be the best representation of what we would have gotten. But also, Peter Jackson, who did Lord of the Rings, is apparently putting together a documentary about the recording process of this entire album, which I didn't even know until researching for this video. But yeah, that's coming out in November, so hopefully with that we have a better idea of what this album was supposed to be. Rock as a genre actually has a ton of lost record stories like these from artists like Jimi Hendrix or Pink Floyd, but I don't really want to get into those right now because I feel like I would want to know more about their current discography to make judgments on their unreleased discography. I know what you're thinking, William, you haven't heard enough of Pink Floyd or Jimi Hendrix to make judgments on them? Oh my gosh, where do you go from here? Who have you listened to enough to be able to talk?
Hey, I just met you.
Carly Rae Jepsen apparently made an indie album. After Call Me Maybe dominated the unearned positive vibes of 2012, Carly Rae Jepsen said it was natural for her to want to rebel against those pop roots, so she started recording music that fell more in line with indie music. But she said it was really weird stuff. So we're not talking Taylor Swift's Folklore indie or Bon Iver's indie. Bon Iver? I don't know. Anyways, we're talking something strange, and that is what makes this so interesting for me, because strange could mean a lot of things, especially to a musician. Something can be weird about music without the music being outright weird. So I'm wondering, is this like Bare Naked Ladies weird, or is this like Ben Folds pre-Rockin' the Suburbs weird?
It's free!
I think it'd be interesting to see that kind of shift from an artist, especially 7 years before Taylor did it, but Carly seems to only have wanted to get that out of her system. It was never an album meant to be released to the public, and she says we will never get to hear it. Artists really like to do that one. Missy Elliott says she has 6 albums worth of unreleased music. I mean, like, that we will never get to hear. It makes me so angry. She also says she won't set dates for new albums because her fans get too angry with her when she doesn't deliver. And that's just ridiculous. Another good example of a lost album comes from Green Day. They had an entire album recorded that was going to be released in around 2003 to 2004 called Cigarettes and Valentines. The album was supposed to be a return to their punk roots after a slight departure in albums like Nimrod and Warning. But the songs got stolen, so the band had to go back and record a new album, and we had to settle for Stupid Old American Idiot instead. Yeah, this is probably the only case so far where I actually prefer the fact that the album got lost, because without Cigarettes and Valentines getting lost, we would have never gotten American Idiot, and as much as teenage William probably would have loved an album that satisfied his weird obsession with cigarettes still being cool. I mean, especially cooler than America or Idiots, am I right? American Idiot was just too important to the landscape of rock and to indoctrinating a bunch of people, including myself, into the genre. On the other side of that spectrum, however, we have Weezer. The album that they lost might have actually ended up doing a lot of good, if only because of what it ends up replacing. The album in question is called Songs from the Black Hole, and it was going to be a space opera, which is a pretty big departure from their most recent outing at the time, the Blue Album. We've heard a couple of songs from this album, snippets here and there, but fans have been begging for an official release for years. The only reason it didn't come out at the time is because Rivers Cuomo decided he wanted to focus instead on his newfound college experiences in the Blue Album's actual follow-up, Pinkerton. Had it been finished though, Songs from the Black Hole would have followed the adventures of the Betsy 2, which is a spaceship navigating the universe, and the crewmates trying to navigate the different situations that come from that. The album was super high concept, it had a whole story, all the band members as well as a few guests were going to play characters on the album. It was just a whole thing, and although it was supposed to navigate the emotions that Rivers felt touring with a big rock band, it was definitely less personal than Pinkerton would end up being, and that really might have been a good thing. Okay, so yeah, I know what I just said, and I know that that is a controversial sentence, so let me explain really quickly. I do not have any problems with the album Pinkerton. I know it is one of Weezer's most beloved. I'm not saying it's a bad album and that it should be erased from existence. The reason that I think Songs from the Black Hole would have been an interesting substitute is because of Pinkerton's effects on the band. See, Pinkerton was a very personal album for Rivers Cuomo. I mean, he put his heart and soul into it, and music fans, as we do, tore it apart when it was first released. I mean, we really tore him a new one. So Rivers was kind of sent back into a box where he only wanted to play music if he knew it would work. Music like the Blue Album, and that kind of resulted in every album post-Pinkerton trying to be the Blue Album, even though for the most part, Rivers had grown out of that sound by the time Pinkerton was released. I know that people like the albums post-Pinkerton, and I'm not trying to say that all of them are bad. If I'm being honest, I never really got into Weezer myself, so I'm not the best person to speak on how they've progressed. I just think that this is an interesting concept. If you replace a personal album with this concept album, it might not have hurt Rivers so badly if it got panned, and they might have progressed differently and had a completely different sound to the one that we see now. But if you're curious as to what that album would have sounded like even without the butterfly effect it would have caused, we actually know a little bit about that. Like I said earlier, some fans found leaks, and that actually leads me into our final category, which are lost albums that we can speculate on a little bit more accurately because of different leaks that fans have scraped together over the years.
Lying in bed, just like Brian Wilson did.
The most famous of this kind of album is probably Smile by the Beach Boys. It was supposedly going to be an album that stacked up to Sgt. Pepper by the Beatles, which, for those of you who don't know, is constantly listed on different best album of all time lists, and this was apparently going to be even better than that. The album's been described as sort of a psychedelic project, and it was supposed to capture what it felt like to grow up. Brian Wilson described it as a teenage symphony to God. This is actually an album I hadn't heard about until I started researching for this video. I basically typed in best albums that were lost to time into Google, and this appeared on every single list, and every Reddit thread that I went down had people saying that it would have changed the music landscape forever. It was like, literally, it was a general consensus that this would have been a big project if it had just come out. Usually the theory regarding Smile is that if it had been released back in the 60s when it was intended to, it would have pushed more musicians, specifically the Beatles, to be more experimental and psychedelic with their music, thus creating a completely different landscape for music today, where artists are a little bit more experimental and the music just sounds different. I don't know if that's good different or bad different, but it is incredibly different. And I don't know, I might have been in some music nerd threads, I don't know exactly who was commenting like this, but it was actually kind of wild to me that there is this project out there that so many people agreed would have changed music, because You know, when I started making this video, I kind of thought that was not really a topic people discussed, but apparently not only is it, but they have an album that they put as the stamp of that entire idea that you could change history with a different unreleased album. So, I don't know. I thought it was a worthy inclusion on this list. As for what happened to the album, Brian Wilson was struggling with a lot of issues at the time of creating the album, and his growing problems with depression and drugs sort of cursed the project. They just couldn't get anything done the way they wanted it to be done, and eventually the project just died. Moving on, I think I would regret it if I made a video about lost music and didn't mention Mac Miller. This is a poster of Mac Miller. I never show the top of this poster, except for in a couple of my early videos, so this is a poster of Mac Miller, though. I don't know why I felt that you could have probably gathered that from context clues, and now I have to put this back up, or just do the rest of this take with it. But yeah, Mac Miller had a lot of songs that he didn't end up releasing. He said for the recording of Watching Movies with the Sound Off, he had recorded something like 400 different songs that he never released, and he's just well known for having a lot of music in his vault and a lot of albums that he never ended up releasing before his passing in 2018. Okay, I think it's time to put him back up. That's not right. Uh-oh. Oh. Okay. The project I'm going to be talking about is one that he recorded around the same time as his 2014 mixtape, Faces. Faces, for those of you who've never heard it, is a sort of psychedelic rap mixtape that had a lot of depressing themes on it, as it was happening during one of the more depressing times in Mac Miller's life, but the tape leans way more into psychedelic sounds than it does depressive sounds. It ends up creating this really interesting music and this entirely great story. I absolutely recommend Faces if you haven't checked it out. I actually recommend everything Mac Miller has ever done. I am, after all, 21 and white. Anyways, the reason I bring that up is because the tape that we're going to be talking about, Balloonerism, was supposed to be a sister tape to Faces, and it had a completely different sound that leaned more on the depressive side of things. I've heard a couple of different explanations as to what this album was supposed to be. Some people say it was a compliment to Faces, and that it was supposed to come out with Faces, but that Mac ended up scrapping it so he could focus solely on Faces. And then other people say that it was a completed project, or a near-completed project, that he kept in his vault for in case he died during the creation of Faces. So if he had died during 2014, they would have released it, but he didn't die during 2014, so they didn't. Now, of course, we do have some idea what Balloonerism would have sounded like, because a couple of years back, almost the entire album leaked online. However, I'm going to try and avoid talking about specific leaks during this video for a couple different reasons. The first being that it is sort of controversial, the idea of listening to leaked music, and a lot of artists have come out against it in the past, and so I don't know where anybody stands on it, and I don't even know where I stand on it, but I do know that I don't want to make specific references to leaked music and then have you have to go out and find that leaked music in order to understand the video. I think that that's not fair if you don't like leaked music, that you can't understand a whole section of my video because of it. The second thing is that since these leaks aren't official releases, we have no idea what part of the process they were in and if they were finished or not, so I'm not trying to judge a musician or an album based off of an unfinished product, and therefore I think it would be fair to speculate what an album would have been like based off of material that wasn't finished. So if a leak has been used as a reference for this video, I have only used it to try and gather an idea of what the album might have sounded like, and not really used it as an idea to judge the album off of. Okay, so with all that in mind, let's round out the video by talking a little about Eminem.
Hi, my name is
The album that we're really going to focus in on today was an album that allegedly was supposed to come out in 2007 by Eminem called King Mathers. Why, for the centerpiece of my video, did I pick every teenage boy's favorite rude man to shout about? Well, that's easy. I'm in love with it. The reason I want to focus on this album is mainly because of the context, because if we're talking about how albums could have changed history for a musician, this is an interesting example to dissect, and also a pretty personal example, if I'm being honest, as this was the first Lost album I had ever heard of. I know this is a lot of preamble, but this is all just to say if you're not an Eminem fan, bear with me here, because the choice wasn't really made to celebrate Eminem, but more because it's an interesting example, and I really think it fits the video. Eminem today is sort of a hit-or-miss artist. He doesn't have as many fans as he used to, as a lot of people are no longer as enthralled with his rude boy attitude or the way he rhymes all his puns.
Except when it comes to having the balls to go against me, you hide them. Cause you don't got the nuts like an empty asylum.
But the Eminem from the time period we're talking about is a completely different story. He was only knee-deep in his career by this point, but he had a fucking meteoric rise. Between the Slim Shady LP, the Marshall Mathers LP, the Eminem Show, and 8 Mile, Eminem had made a name for himself as a skilled lyricist and a professional controversial figure. One of the reasons Eminem had become so popular is because he was famously angry at the world and constantly challenging the status quo, sometimes for better and sometimes for worse. And between this trademark anger, a very public feud with his mom, and an on-again, off-again toxic relationship with his wife, Eminem, by the time he was center stage, left a lot of things to be worried about. And after 8 Mile, things kind of started to spiral for him. His 5th studio album, Encore, was widely panned because it was bad. Eminem will admit this himself, and he puts a lot of the blame for that on the fact that at the time his drug problem was growing worse and worse. So after Encore, he dropped a compilation album, and then he disappeared from the public view for a while. And not long after that, his childhood best friend and frequent collaborator, Proof, was fatally shot. As him addresses in his song Castle, it was a very dark time for him, and it sent him spiraling, until in 2007, it all came to a head when he overdosed. Hey, Editing William here. So I wanted to address really quickly that everything I just said was very tragic, and I think that that's important to say because I use it here as context for this unreleased album, but it's also real shit that happened to a real person. And even though I speculate that King Mathers might have been a great album and that it draws from this pain Eminem felt, that doesn't mean that I want Eminem to have gone through this pain or to even have to talk about this pain to make the album. You know, this is one of those cases where I think when artists draw from pain, it sometimes creates good music, but that doesn't mean that I want artists to go through pain so I can have good music. And I just wanted to put that out there and say that this is real stuff he was dealing with so that we could all move forward through the rest of this basically fan fiction that I have, knowing that, you know, this is tragic and, you know, I don't want this to have happened to Eminem just so that I can get my good album. If I could go back and change it, I would. I would not have any of this happen to him, and I don't think artists should have to go through pain to make good music. So, I don't know, that might have been a little rambly. I didn't want to script that because I feel like scripting it was what caused me to leave it out in the first place. And so I just wanted to say really quickly a real thought. Eminem is a person, and this sucks, and I'm sorry it happened. Alright, back to the video. It was after the overdose that Eminem finally checked into a rehab center and got better, not long after releasing his 6th studio album, Relapse, which wasn't about like an actual relapse, it was just a horrorcore album about drugs and murder. So yeah, Eminem was back, baby! But let's revisit that song Castle for a second.
Can take this fame back, I don't want it. I put out this last album, then I'm done with it. 100% finished, fed up with it, I'm hanging it up, fuck it.
The album he's referring to here is King Mathers, and it has become somewhat of an urban legend among Eminem fans since its rumors in 2007. The name for the album was mostly speculation based on a nickname that his fellow rapper Cassius had for him at the time, and the whole album was rumored to have been worked on during 2007, placing it before his overdose. A lot of people have spent a lot of time trying to put together an idea of what the album would have sounded like. John Banana, a YouTuber who has put a lot of research into it, says that it was probably going to be a lot darker in tone from the sillier Encore and focus mostly on problems that the rapper was facing at the time, such as his second divorce and the death of his best friend. It was also supposed to be pretty critical of the rap industry at the time, something that Eminem has become no stranger to since. A lot of this theory is pulled from leaks from around the time the album was supposed to have come out, so a lot of people have already dismissed this album based on the quality of those leaks because they think they sound bad. I may have perused some of the leaks, and I personally disagree with the idea that all of them are bad, but like I said, we're gonna go ahead and throw out the leaks as an official way to judge the album, and instead focus on the themes that we can find within the leaks. Now, the leaks provide us with an idea of the subject and tone of the album, but they also provide us with the indication that this would have been his last album ever had he completed it. And given what we have, this project did have a lot of potential. I mean, Eminem is arguably at his best when he's at his most personal, and this album did seem like it was going to be pretty personal. Plus, it was going to be the last album in his legacy, at least for a while, so it probably would have changed the way that we looked back at him and what he did. In my opinion, and the opinion of a lot of Eminem fans, which I guess technically could be biased on this subject, this had all the makings of a classic. Plus, think of how Eminem's core demographic probably would have reacted to this album. I mean, Eminem at the time was mostly known for rapping about his struggles, first with his struggles in getting fame, and then in his struggles of dealing with fame, but for the most part, when he talked about that stuff, he talked about it with anger. These albums have been described as a great album to listen to when you're getting worked up or angry, and that's probably why they have become the most popular with the angriest type of creature, the teenage boy. But what about the next logical emotion after anger, the thing most teenage boys actually need? A good cry. King Mathers was slated to be a much more somber outing for Eminem. It was supposed to be a lot sadder, a lot more slow-paced, at least if some of the leaks are to be believed. He wasn't going to come at this the way he normally came at things. He was going to be a little bit more emotional about it. And for Eminem to drop to his fan base of mostly angry people an album that actually explored sadness, that probably would have been pretty interesting. It's also another example of a piece of work that, if it was released, could have possibly changed the artist's trajectory drastically. Eminem reached a point after Relapse where he was kind of trying to recapture this sound that he had already grown out of by the time he released The Eminem Show in 2002. In his first two albums, a violent and offensive persona dominated a lot of what he did, and it worked for him at the time because of where he was in his life and what he wanted to talk about. But by The Eminem Show, he had sort of moved on and matured into a different sound and topic matter, and the only reason he shed it in Encore was because of the drug use. And from what we've heard of King Mathers, it sounded like he returned to a little bit more of a mature subject matter and back to the tone that he had sort of started adopting in The Eminem Show. I don't know, this is sort of starting to sound like a William Winsett fanfiction, but I'm just saying, maybe if a more personal album had been released and gotten well received, he would have kept growing as an artist rather than trying to return to what was popular in the first place. Like, the same thing that I was saying with Weezer, he wouldn't have put himself in the box of what he thought worked for him. And I like Eminem just fine, I'm just getting a little bit tired of Slim Shady, the persona he uses to say offensive things. It's just getting old, especially from an artist who I think has a lot more to say than that. I mean, if things had happened exactly as I say they did, it would have been a different trajectory for Eminem probably. Maybe better, maybe worse, but different. And I'd be interested to see what that looks like, especially because I've been so dissatisfied with him as an artist recently. Okay, I'm starting to remind myself of, like, the meme with the floating city, so I'm gonna start to disprove myself a little bit here, just so that we have both sides of the argument laid out. All the things I'm saying do require the album to be good, which there's no guarantee that it would have been. And also, it doesn't just have to be good, it has to be good and well received, which Eminem does not have a great track record of. Relapse, the album that eventually sent Eminem down the path that he's on now, was initially very poorly received, but has since gained a cult following. But that doesn't matter, because it was initially very poorly received, thus Eminem is sent down the path he's on now. Also, this all kind of relies on the idea that Eminem eventually gets better after King Mathers is released, which was not a guarantee. This is kind of the darker side to this lost album, but a lot of fans agree that had this album seen the light of day, it would mean that Eminem probably wasn't doing well. And Eminem's discography today is reflective of the fact that he did eventually get better. Whatever you think about the new albums, all of them reflect his passion for music that was reinvigorated after his relapse. He's got a new lease on life, and that's what his discography reflects, but King Mathers would have reflected how his lease on life was almost up. He'd given up. He was ready to be done. So there you go. None of what I said is necessarily likely to have happened had Eminem released King Mathers. It's just my speculation. But it does lead me into the thing I want to leave you with. Again, Eminem is the artist I use because this is the first Lost album I had heard about, thus the one I had the most time to think on, and so I thought it would be the best one for me to dissect because I had been doing research for a while. But really, you could do this kind of what-if scenario with any of the albums I talked about today, or any Lost album you know about, and I think that's the most interesting thing about today's topic. I mean, imagine your favorite artist is hiding some groundbreaking piece of work in their vault. They had an album they were gonna release but never did. How does that affect them and their career? How does it affect you, who connects so deeply with their music? I don't know, it changes so much about my life if I think about it too much. If you want to, you can discuss it down below. I had a ton of fun doing research for this video, and I'd love some more suggestions if I ever decide to return to the topic. But I don't want to make my point a plea for engagement, so you don't have to comment if you don't want to. I'm not your mom. Yet. So just think about these fun what-ifs, and try to imagine what would be different if Lost albums weren't lost. Does the artist change? Do you change? Does the sound of music in general change? It's just fun to think about. At least I think so. Anyways, I'm done. Bye.